And with the mocks or the scrape scenario after this major storm, do you think there's anything? And I say this because I had this buck that I did kill on this public land piece was that core buck that I was hunting, but I had like 3 other 140 to 160 bucks hitting that scrape right after that storm. Do you think it's like them catching a scent, see who's moving, or is it just the fact that they are moving, but these are all bucks that are not living on the property?
Yeah, I think it's just that they're moving a lot more
right
front,
not necessarily freshening that scrape up.
No, because our scrapes are open right now. So we have does and fawns hitting our scrapes right now, and it's end of April.
Yeah.
So when they travel through that area, they're hitting that pattern. It's just, to me, at that time, the weather is telling me I need to get my butt in the stand, because he's already told me he's moving through that area. He might hit 4 mock scrapes during that daylight, or 5 over a half-mile period. He's just moving more. And that's why we see the water hole use pick up at that time of the year. It's like all of a sudden, the pre-rut begins when on October 22nd, it's 40 degrees and 45, and they're all of a sudden you get bucks hitting water holes at 10 in the morning, 1 in the afternoon, where before they were only hitting them in the evening, coming from dry bedding areas to food sources.
Yeah. Yep. That makes sense.
Just because I failed at this, and I don't want to get off the subject of actually hunting these bucks, but when I did a water hole, I actually, just sunk the tub into the dirt. I didn't try to have it naturally fill or anything. What is your best recipe for success? Like the lip up, obviously dug in, what kind of tub?
It's been a kind of a migration over the years, but about 20 years ago, we started using half barrels, like a plastic barrel, 27.5 gallon.
Okay.
And we quickly learned that that wasn't enough water, even if we filled it. We had 15-gallon milk jugs. We would roll down to a spot. Sometimes they'd roll 50 yards past. You have to drag it back up. It was a pain. But we started saucering it out. We put the 27.5 gallon tank below ground level so that we're actually holding 40 gallons in a puddle. And we found that wasn't enough either. So we started using 110 gallon stock tanks. And from TSC, they're about $75. And then we started putting so they're a foot above the ground. And then we'd have does walking by, stomping and looking at the water hole.
Yeah, too noticeable.
They don't like it's unnatural. So then we start burying them completely below ground level, so that not only do the deer not notice them as much, but then they're self-filling a lot better. So kind of almost going back to the 27.5 gallon half barrel, where we're actually saucering it to try to collect more water, or putting it into the side of a hill, a little bit of a slight elevation, so it collects water when it rains.
So you're cutting a plastic barrel in half then.
We did, but we found that wasn't enough water, that 27.5 gallons. Okay. So I encourage people to at least use 90 to 100 gallons plus.
It's just your cattle tub, basically.
Yes. Yeah. And you're putting a stick in it for the critters. And it's funny, this morning, I put a video out this morning. Dylan and I shot a new stand location that we're specifically putting in to try to kill empty. Yeah. And that one, I talk about where that water hole's at and the whole combination of the strategy, but we're putting we'll put a stick into it, and it's a 110 gallon tank. 150 is not bad if you have a skid steer to go dig it, because it's just a lot of shovel work. It's a pain.
What do you mean by putting a stick in it, Jeff?
A critter stick so the deer can get out. And so we learned that the hard way a long time ago, that we put a new water hole in, and we come back and there's a dead squirrel in it, because they get down in that water
and then over the lip. Yeah.
And they can't jump out.
Yeah.
So then we'll put a big stick in there, and that seems to work really well. And
I came back to, what do you mean put a stick in it?
Yeah.
Well, Jeff's just tired of fishing out dead squirrels. Oh yeah, there you go.
Sticking out.
Yep. Yeah.
So that log sticking out of there, so that it's funny. It's like I've seen it where a squirrel falls in. So they fall into the tank, they thrash around in panic, and all of a sudden they hit the log and they get out, and then they're stressed out. They go sit over and shiver by an oak. They just sit there, and you can tell it's like they almost stressed.
Not cool. Yeah. Not cool.
And then it's Buddy that was watching the whole thing, goes over on the lip and does the same thing.
Yeah. That picture you showed is exact, like that looked like my setup, and I couldn't get a deer to hit it. So I'm going to try that.
I'm curious, Jeff, what are your thoughts on putting water holes on properties that already have existing, creeks and
That's a good question. I I had a question about that again. I get that question all the time on the waterhole videos. And someone was asking, you know, I have a creek, there's a bedding area here, and it comes in. So it's too long of an answer for YouTube. Let's put it that way. I mean, if I can, I'm going to censor too, but there's so many other comments to answer. So I answered this. YouTube said I engaged with 27,000 comments last year on YouTube. So
holy
I want to just hit them quick and move on. But
yeah,
you know, I look at it like if the deer are bedded dry and they're on the way to an evening food source and it's dry in between, it doesn't matter if there's water 100 yards the opposite direction, because they're not going to leave their beds, go 100 yards out of the way, except maybe the rut. If they establish that pattern where they're leaving a dry area, hitting water on the way to the food, then that's really all it takes. So you could have, like around here, a lot of good water hole use in the tops of these ridges where we have tons of water down below in rivers, creek systems, cattle ponds, even cattle ponds out in the field here. But again, if it's between dry bedding areas, if it's between a dry bedding area and afternoon food source, then it will work.
Or just has better cover and maybe less pressure involved.
Well, it's consistent too, because you'll have like water holes or swamps that dry out, and they'll dry out even during the hunting season. But if you can keep water, we go in with like a 275 gallon tank in the back of a pickup or trailer, and you back right in there and just throw water in it. We can keep water in those, and especially middle of October. Well, that dry water hole next door or swamp might be completely dry at that time, and it's not attracting anything. And what I find is if deer are hitting water consistently in a certain spot and then it dries out, it takes a couple of weeks for them to realize that, hey, there's water back in it. The daily patterns.
If you have like an ephemeral pond, kind of like Jeremy, that Kentucky lease that we've got like one of those ponds, that ephemeral pond up there that's going to dry up. Would you recommend, if it's in that ideal spot like this one is, would you recommend in trying to, because I interned for Grant and he did a ton of ponds, you know, the bentonite. Do you suggest trying to like dig it out when it's dry, bentoniting it, or like trying to make that work, or just going ahead and putting a tub in there?
Well, and that's a good question. Remind me about EHD with that too. But what I'm doing is we have that 275 gallon. Now in the back of a half-ton pickup, you can probably only put about 160 gallons safely, 170, especially if you have hills. But I'd put a 3-foot piece of PVC pipe on it and just back up to that and fill it, you know. So if that's going to hold water, but it's just dry, boy, you can put 160 gallons in that, even do it twice. Now you have 300 and some gallons in there, probably last. One of the problems with EHD, and I think it's a huge benefit with the tanks, is you're not establishing that drying, cracking mud around the outside of that tank because water is not above tank level. So you don't have that midge that can propagate in that drying, cracked mud in the late summertime around a tank versus some of those ponds. So those ponds receding, you have all the mud. And so I believe that it's not that you're EHD proof in the property, but I'd rather have, like we're taking 2 water holes out this year where they're just not in the right location, but I look at them as just big EHD spreaders too.
Yeah, that's a big one, man. And I'm looking at it again. A lot of what I'm hunting is big timber, ridges, terrain-based stuff. You know, even in Pennsylvania, like I've got some beautiful creeks that run through these properties. The one thing that I'm finding is most of the deer movement is not in tune with those creeks and that terrain.
Not at all.
Right? It's ridge based. It's coming out of bedding areas that are on top of these knobs and then dropping through. And so even though there is a prevalent water source throughout the entire year, I'm sure at some point they're hitting those. But I will say from an observational standpoint, cameras and in person, I don't see these deer touching those creeks. Right. And so I wonder the benefit of placing some of these water holes directly in the path from bedding to food along these ridges and stuff, which naturally the water from a rain is running down, could create just a really significant tree stand spot.
I think your property on the mountain could certainly benefit from it.
Yeah.
Which is interesting, though, because both of our properties have, well, that's a lot more terrain than where I'm at in Ohio. But, Jeff, where I'm at, deer can't go anywhere without crossing a creek somewhere. So I've struggled to
it is tough.
Get real excited about water holes. However, I have done one water hole where it made sense. In fact, I kind of just, we did a culvert there and I dammed it up a little bit. I've got a real nice water hole that I've got plenty of pictures of bucks rolling around in it and stuff, and it's awesome. But most of my property, if a buck is coming off of a bedding area, typically, Weston, we talked about this last week, they're staging low and then getting ready to go back up to the next food source. And in every creek, there's there's water almost year round.
And see, I'm not seeing that movement. Although those creeks are existing, I'm seeing like ridge to ridge and or running saddles and stuff.
Well,
and
mine is a hill.
there.
Yours is a mountain.
Yeah, there's nothing. There's nothing
difference.
there, right? And so, and again, you know, this is where I'm looking at it from a strategic standpoint. I've got oaks and acorns everywhere, right? How am I in between these food plots and stuff? Yeah. How am I drawing them into an area that is, you know, essentially a better kill funnel?
Have you ever seen your property kind of have you guys ever come across this called Hill Country Bucks? Was this video that these guys did a while ago?
Is that like Texas Hill Country?
No, it's just Hill Country in general. They did another one called Farm Country Bucks.
Oh yeah, I remember that. Yeah, yep.
And these guys were big on like, you know, finding basically scouting an area.
It's terrain based.
Yeah, it's terrain based. Anyways, those guys killed a buck on a water hole. So what they did was they had a water hole set up kind of adjacent to a bedding area on the downwind side of a ridge. And like this buck just got up out of his bed, walked, you know, 100, 150 yards right over to this water hole in broad daylight, and he smashed it. I could see you doing something like that on this property.
I mean, I've seen a lot of that. And again, early in the season, heats up, you know, in between that bedding and food. I think those water sources are super critical, especially in Kentucky when we're talking early season velvet, September-based type stuff. But then as we get to that more active time period in October and November for the rut, you know, deer need to be consuming that. The water content in the food that they're eating is much, much less than it is most of the other year. You know, so it's just trying to, again, it's getting creative, right? And I've got 1,000 acres on the mountain to hunt. I also have 30 acres behind my house that I'm thinking about it. I've got a huge creek that runs at the bottom, but there's no deer. It's closer to the road too. There's no deer touching that I see.
No, they don't go out of their way far. They don't go out of their way that far to hit it.
Exactly.
Especially if they have to go through open cover. It's not on the way. I mean, they're efficient movers. And what you find too is they'll hit a muddy, just dirt filled, algae filled, mosquito filled water hole versus a clear creek anytime. And Azoga told me he thought it could be either nutrients that are or some type of mineral or something.
Yeah.
Or he said also, you know, they're very efficient creatures. They want to just go take a drink and move on. And that's what I like about water holes too. It's a quick stop and they're moving off. You don't get in and out and spook them that much. But he thought the temperature of the water, if it's significantly higher in those areas, they can just drink really quick and leave. It's not this cold shock to their system where they're drinking this 50-degree Steamer Creek. But he said, you know, they have to study it. Of course, those are just him kind of throwing ideas out there. Right. They do seem to hit muddy, algae-filled water. And so on Jared, on your property, you might find that something that's muddy and dirt filled and a little bit more natural, they might actually hit consistently, especially if it's on the way to that afternoon food source.
Well, remember you had that one mineral lick that tended to flood around it. It was on a stump.
It's actually right by the water hole.
But it would fill with water, and I think those deer obviously
they loved it.
Yeah,
they dug it out and made it a water hole of its own, and it fills up when it rains. And
I remember asking you about that. It looked like a swamp, like Maverick was sitting in it. Yeah,
that's where I had a bunch of pictures. A goose was that 160-inch